So we're ready to start now. I'm Devesh Kapoor, the director of CASI, and it's a great pleasure to welcome you all to our annual lecture. Our speaker this evening is Mr. Steve Coll, who's the president of the New America Foundation. And what I'll do is to invite Mr. Marshall Bouton, who is the president of the Chicago Council of Global Affairs and the chairman of the International Advisory Board of CASI, to introduce our speaker. Marshall.
Thank you, Devesh. Is this working? Yeah, I guess so, yeah. Well, first I want to say, both to those of you who are familiar with CASI, involved with CASI one way or another, and to those of you who are not, and for whom this may be a first encounter with CASI. It is a remarkable organization, and I've believed ever since it was created, and I believe even more today, that it is quite literally a unique institution in the United States. It is the only university-based center for the advanced study of contemporary India in our country. There are India studies programs around the country in many institutions, but no university has made the commitment to dedicate a graduate level and senior research level focus on contemporary India in the way Penn has. It was an inspired vision from the beginning, and Devesh Kapoor has taken it to extraordinary new heights. I keep in pretty regular touch with what's going on in CASI for obvious reasons, but I was reading the materials coming in on the plane today, and I was once again immensely impressed, Devesh, with what you've accomplished, and want to thank you for your leadership of CASI, especially on this occasion. Well, the standard phrase is it's a privilege and a pleasure to introduce Steve Coll. It's a privilege and a pleasure to introduce Steve Coll. I've been an admirer of Steve's work ever since he was Washington Post correspondent in the late 80s, early 90s. And I became even more deeply so later on when I read his book, about which I'll speak in a moment. Going to talk to us today about the perils of peace, reimagining risk and reward in South Asia. Steve Coll is a very rare combination, even in American life. He is a highly accomplished journalist, having been with the Washington Post for 20 years and 6 of them as its managing editor. He is an extraordinarily gifted author of 6 books. He is an astute, deeply thoughtful commentator about a very wide range of international, political, and economic affairs, and domestic, for that matter, as well. And it's really that latter quality that led Devesh and me to think of Steve for the CASI lecture, for the Nand and Jeet Khemka lecture. And we're deeply grateful to the Khemka family for making this possible. It is a time of further transition in India and in the India-US relationship. And we thought it would be particularly interesting to have someone with Steve's breadth as well as his depth of insight to talk about India and South Asia at this moment. Those 6 books include one for which he won one of his 2 Pulitzer Prizes. Title is Ghost Wars: The Secret History of the CIA, Afghanistan and Bin Laden, from the Soviet invasion to September 2001. For those of you who have not read it, I want highly to recommend it to you. Not only because it's an extraordinary piece of research and writing. It's 600 pages, 550, something. something that order of magnitude. And it's a page turner. You just rip through it because it is so beautifully written and such a gripping story. I recommend it not only because it is such a fine book, and I said to Steve before we came in here that what I'm about to say was not meant to be gratuitous flattery, but a genuine sentiment on my part. I think, for me, Ghost Wars is one of the 2 or 3 best books I've read in the last 25 years. And I like to think not just because of my interest in that part of the world. It's, of course, need I tell you all, a piece of work of extraordinary relevance to the situation we are now in South Asia, and to the challenges and problems the United States and India face as they look ahead, and as the President and the Prime Minister no doubt discussed at length this week. So if you really want to understand how we got where we are in South Asia today, in Afghanistan and Pakistan in particular, read this book. And with that, I'd like to ask Steve Coll to come and speak to us. Thank you.
Thank you, Marshall. That was extraordinarily kind and generous and undeserved, but appreciated nonetheless. Really grateful for it. And thank you, Devesh and CASI, for making this possible. I'm really pleased to be with you and honored to be a part of this lecture series. I do have a personal connection to this subject. As Marshall referred to, I was assigned to Delhi in 1989 by the Washington Post, and I went out there with my family. My son was born in Delhi, and I've been coming and going for all the years since, and initially as a sort of traveling reporter devoted just to bearing witness and trying to make sense of very complicated events, both in India and Pakistan, as well as Afghanistan, and then increasingly, as the years have passed, trying to think a little bit more analytically and a little bit more over the horizon about the pattern of events that we've all seen come and go. And there is a repetitious quality to some of the subjects that we're going to talk about together tonight. And Marshall said something that was funny in the reception about it being a roller coaster, in the sense that you go over the same track 5 times before you get to the end of the ride. And I certainly feel, as someone who started writing about the problem of Islamist militancy, transnational militancy in 1989, and who wrote his first newspaper story about Osama bin Laden in 1993 when he was in Sudan, and who's now written, in effect, 2 books about bin Laden and Al-Qaeda and the problem of transnational jihad in South Asia, that there comes a point where the repetition of the subject matter reaches a stage of absurdity. And just to give you a flavor of it, when I was out on the road promoting the paperback version of the Bin Ladens, which is a book that came after Ghost Wars about Saudi Arabia and the history of the Bin Laden family across the 20th century. I was doing a radio show in San Francisco as an AM talk radio show through the morning, and the host was one of those old school radio hosts who warned me as we went on the air to take calls from listeners that he might do a live commercial during the interview, and I should just go with the flow. So we were on the air taking calls from callers around the Bay Area, and somebody called in and asked the question that inevitably comes up about where is Osama bin Laden? And I said, well, I don't know. I gave a sort of version of the answer. And then he turned to me and he said, so do you think he's in a cave? And I said, no, I don't really see him in a cave. I think he's probably in North Waziristan. He might be in one of those big mud fortresses that the Afridis build up on the border. And I would imagine if he's got a little compound of his own that he's sleeping pretty comfortably. And then he looked at me and he said, what kind of mattress do you think he's sleeping on? Because folks, if it's a Sealy Posturepedic, and I thought, okay, this is what it's come to. I'm out on the road selling mattresses with Osama bin Laden, and we're still talking about it. But I think the loop of familiar challenges and patterns does move forward, and in the more serious way that I want to talk about with my 30 or 40 minutes here. I think we are moving forward, but we are still searching for the next narrative about security and politics in South Asia. And I, I was reflecting as I was preparing for this talk on this notion of the need for new language and new ways of framing the future of South Asia. We've been working on this at the foundation some over the last few months, and certainly one becomes aware after a long engagement with these subjects that there is a pattern, certainly in American engagement with the region, of American policymakers constantly having to trade off short-term security goals for long-term sustainability. And this has been a pattern dating back to the Cold War. Certainly it was present when I arrived in 1989. There's always a short-term emergency that seems to demand compromises in American engagement in the region at the expense of what intuition and knowledge tells us is required to build a more sustainable, prosperous, middle-class driven future for the region. And we struggled to find the language to change, to break out of that pattern. And one reason why I'm pleased to be speaking to you about this and thinking with you about it is that I think the new narratives have generally come from the outside, both in India and in Pakistan. That it has been the business community, it's been the diaspora, it's been the academic community that has started to think ahead and then to pull through democratic politics in India, politicians and government along. And I think the next generation of narrative about the future of South Asia is probably going to have to come from the outside as much as from the deal makers and the diplomats and the insiders. And I would encourage all of you who are part of investing in the future of India to think of yourselves as architects, not just of the economic future of the country, but also of solutions to these dilemmas. You know, I was thinking back to when I arrived in 1989, and as the Berlin Wall fell and India struggled to define itself in the post-Cold War transition. At that time, there were two competing narratives. On the one hand, there was the old narrative of state-dominated socialism, of anti-colonialism, the hangover of suspicion of the colonial powers and the West, the language of the Cold War. And on the other hand, there was a new narrative rising, a competing narrative, and its most important source of articulation during my time came from the finance minister of India at that time, who was Manmohan Singh. He was the first to stand before the Indian public as an elected politician and put himself at risk by challenging the old narrative, by saying it's time to throw off this hangover of suspicion and isolation and to start to engage in a way consistent with India's way of engaging in the world and with India's values and national interests, but to really stop relying on the old cliches as a defensive mechanism. And I remember being struck as a young reporter by just the raw display of rare political courage, knowing that he was an academic and that he could afford to think beyond the election cycle perhaps more than some other professional politicians might. But he really did start to change the narrative within India and gave political space to colleagues to start to compete over what was rising naturally out of the business classes and the cities and the universities and the sources of innovation at the time. So 20 years later, I think we face a similar sort of pair of narratives that compete with one another. On the one hand, after 9/11, after the terrorism that India has endured, after the attack on Parliament in December of 2001, after the Red Fort, after Mumbai, after 9/11, after 7/7, we have the very real challenge and the narrative associated with that challenge: security, conflict, threat, fear. And competing with it is another narrative, not necessarily an exclusive choice, but a rising narrative that is grounded in also material facts, observable facts, the extraordinary transformation in India's economy, the extraordinary transformation in the lives of many tens of millions of Indians, the transformation of personal and generational experience in one of the most important civilizations in the world, giving rise to a vision of economic integration, prosperity, and normalization in the region, and a vision of aspiration. And not to over-romanticize the Prime Minister of India, because I've learned through a long career in journalism never to romanticize politicians, but once again, the language, the articulation of the alternative narrative does belong to Manmohan Singh and his world of his vision of a world without borders, a region where borders don't matter. He was able to construct in his discourse about a settlement with Pakistan in his earlier administration, I thought as he did in 91, some crystallizing language that was both accessible and profound. Breakfast in Delhi, lunch in Lahore, Rawalpindi, and dinner in Kabul, that should be the world that he lived in, much as it's now the world that East Asians and Europeans and increasingly residents of Latin America live in. So we have these competing narratives. And as in 91, it seems daunting to think about how they'll ever be reconciled. I think there were many around the time, even when I was leaving in 92, who never believed that India would open up and prosper the way it has. I felt that it would, and that was based just on the sense of what was happening in Mumbai at the time, and the changes that were so palpable, not in the elites, but in the lower middle classes and in the urban classes that were so dynamic at that time. And I do believe that the aspirational narrative will again prevail, but I find this competition between narratives to be more daunting and more worrisome because of the nature of the problem and the presence of so much peril in the conflict and in the arsenals of the competing states. So let's talk about these two competing narratives and what it might take to reconcile them, or what it might take to engineer the sort of change that would be analogous to the change that occurred within India after the Cold War's end. This vision that Prime Minister Singh has articulated and that his government reiterates as India's goal, and Ambassador Singh was down at the New America Foundation this week and gave a lunchtime talk that sounded very much like the Prime Minister's original vision. So it is still sort of declared policy of the government of India. It's not fanciful. It's not an aspiration. It is a concrete set of potential agreements and arrangements. It is consonant with concrete interests that are measurable. The interests of the government and the people of India, and the interests of the government and people of Pakistan, for that matter. And I don't just mean the interests that nation states have in prosperity and stability, but also material interests, such as the plausibility of energy supply for power generation over the next 30 or 40 years, which is really a natural gas story that is a little bit difficult to imagine, sort of solutions for if the transit spaces are conflict zones for the next 20 years. So I want to bring us down to the concrete aspects of this vision and to talk a little bit about the engineering problem that now lies ahead, because it's my sense increasingly that we're past the point of visualization. The framework of a normalized South Asia, a more open border, and I don't mean peace, love, and understanding in every sphere of the subcontinent's life, but I mean a region that looks more and more as Latin America does today, and that in 20 years will look as East Asia does today, a place where civil-military relations, once troubled, have been overtaken by the rise of civilian governments committed to open borders and internal markets and political pluralism, and where residual conflicts are increasingly marginal in the region, and where state competition persists, as it does today in East Asia, but where the field of competition is shifting to the pace of innovation, the quality of national education, the tools of monetary policy, rather than physical and territorial conflict. So if that is the framework, if that is what we visualize together, and as I say, I give the Prime Minister credit for encapsulating for public consumption a sense of what that world would be by choosing his words and also choosing his analogies to other regions that have benefited from such integration, then what's the engineering problem? How do we get from here to there? And I think I don't propose to answer that question for you tonight with a blueprint, but I want to walk us together through some of the engineering efforts that have been made, the sketches that are half done or three-quarters done, and then to analyze some of the reasons why it has been difficult to date to pull this blueprint all the way forward. What are the obstacles? What are the choices? What are the ways of thinking about overcoming the obstacles? So I want to go back to the origin of the peace process between India and Pakistan. I'm not going to walk through a detailed diplomatic history, but I wanted to make one point about the origins of the compulsion that led the governments of India and Pakistan to come so close as they did, and I'll talk a little bit about that in late 2006, early 2007. In my experience of India, I start with not political leadership, but what I think often moves democratic leaders, which is the donor base. And in the United States, when politics change in some profound way, it may be constituent politics, grassroots movements that move political leaders to change direction. But it is also sometimes where the funding is located. And in India, you could sense, being around the donors and the politicians who worked with them, that starting in the early and mid-90s, during the Narasimha Rao period, the donor base started to shift into a vision of Indian policy that was distinct from what the donor base had wished for in the past. And the competition that grew up between the BJP and later the Congress Party to define India's role in this next era created a context in which political leaders started to think more creatively and to take more risks in integrating India's potential into the global economy than they would have done in the 80s or the 70s. In any event, we know where it began. We know the false starts, Agra, and the bus tour to Lahore. What developed in my mind over that period was a cross-party consensus within the Indian elites, and one that began increasingly to encompass the bureaucracy, the civil service, and the foreign service, so that it was no longer a competition, just a political competition, but increasingly a national consensus that this outcome, if achievable, was desirable. I remember being at the Washington Post, and I keep knocking my head to try to remember when it was. It was fairly early on in the first BJP government when L.K. Advani came and visited the Washington Post. He came for breakfast, and I hosted the breakfast. And I was just becoming animated by these ideas. Maybe Agra had just happened, something along those lines. And he sat down next to me, and the first question I asked him before he'd even had any tea was, is a stable, modernizing, democratic Pakistan in India's national interest? And he said, yes, right away. And I thought, okay, if you can snap that answer together at 8:15 in the morning, then I'm starting to be convinced that at least this pattern of thinking is being distributed in the elites. And it built up and it built up. Now, it's not mysterious why a consensus that a stable, modernizing, democratic Pakistan, economically integrated with India, would be in broad brush in India's national interests, or why broad constituencies within India would come to that conclusion. It makes sense. A more interesting question is why gradually did Pakistan's more fractured and army-dominated elites come to the same conclusion? And that's a tougher nut to crack. It makes sense, of course, for the civilian democratic parties in Pakistan to see economic integration with democratic, prosperous India as in their interests, because, for one thing, it creates space for them to pull away from military domination. But why would President Musharraf gradually move in the way that he did? Now, I had dinner with him last night. It was off the record, so I can't talk about the content of it. But it was just a stunning reminder of who this person was and is in such an important period. A man, now without reference to the dinner, a man of extraordinary self-belief and bluffness and determination in some ways, a commando by training, and to some extent an accidental leader, to some extent once in power, a very determined sort of organizer of his own authority, not someone who took a lot of counsel. One of the poorest politicians in Pakistan's checkered history as a coalition builder, as someone who listened, as someone who had the deftness to build coalitions in his own self-interest. That's why he failed. In the end, he was a fine general and a commando, but a very poor politician. But I do think that there was, and I do believe that his willingness to take risks, and he was taking risks, even in the context of the relative stability of 2006 in Pakistan, even in the context of his relative control over the Corps Command and over the political scene in Pakistan, which he enjoyed, and we reached its peak in 2006. Even in that context, he was taking risks to consider the agreement that he was moving toward. Now, why? Well, I think he did want a Nobel Prize. He was Davos man, as his colleagues in the army accused him of being. He did appreciate the recognition that he sometimes received on the global stage as a modernizer, as a sort of balancer, as someone who could define Muslim political identity for the West in the post 9/11 world. I think he loved all of that adulation and those reviews when they came in. But that would not have been enough to bring the Corps Command around, I don't believe. And I want to talk a little bit about the final debates as best we understand them within the Corps Command. So let's review the bidding. We have the civilian parties with a national interest in a settlement. We have a president and army chief who has a personal narrative of success and aspiration that maybe takes him into a risk-taking territory. But what about the institution of the army? Why would they come in? And let's remember what they actually did in 2006. The full record of these negotiations and the agreements that were reached in the back channel and so forth is still to be discovered by historians, but we have a pretty good approximation of it. And one of the elements was a sort of demand of conditionality on the Indian side before Prime Minister Singh was himself willing to take the risks of a settlement, a broad settlement, or any sort of comprehensive agreement. He wanted proof that the Pakistani military would deliver along the line of control and in the repression of militant groups that it had fostered for so long. And during 2006, the Pakistan Army did deliver along the line of control. Infiltration rates fell to virtually nil. And that is one reasonable measure, I've always thought, of Pakistani state will. Because while we can debate forever with our Pakistani colleagues about the capacity of the full measure of capacity of the Pakistani state to repress Islamist insurgents on its own soil, what is it reasonable to ask this weak state to do? One thing it is quite reasonable to do is to ask them to control the security zone along the line of control, especially in the disputed territory of Kashmir, because if you travel on the Pakistani side of that line of control, it is an army-dominated security zone. Nobody moves there without the army's permission. So it is not possible to perpetuate the fiction that infiltrations across the LOC are beyond the capacity of the army to control. It's I mean, ones and twos, occasional things, yes, but the pattern of infiltration that had persisted was clearly state policy, and the best measure of that was that the state ended it. So the fact that they could pull that switch said something. Now, I think that contributed in some modest way to the Prime Minister's office's willingness to take risks in 2006 on the Indian side. But we still have the mystery of why. What was the interest of the Corps Command in such a settlement? After all, it is common among Pakistani civilians, for good reason, political leaders, media leaders, civil society, human rights activists, women's activists, to perceive that the narrative of threat, the narrative of perpetual conflict, is fundamental to the corporate interests of the Pakistan Army. That absent that narrative of threat, it has no claim on political life in the proportions that it has made, and it certainly has trouble exacting the rents from the international community that it does to arm itself to build up its conventional deterrent. So there's always been a presumption that the Army would never take a step that jeopardized its possession of this narrative of perpetual conflict. So why in 2006 and 2007 did it do so? I think India's success is the primary reason. The rates of economic growth that were unfolding by that time wrote us a story in and of themselves that the Army had to take account of in thinking about its own corporate plans for the future. If, from the Pakistani Army's perspective, the gap between Indian GDP growth and Pakistani GDP growth was going to persist at 4 or 5 points for the next 20 or 30 years, and if the deterrent that Pakistan had constructed, yes, asymmetrical in the form of a nuclear deterrent and in the form of jihadi militias, but also a conventional deterrent, to be able to at least hold off an Indian force for a couple of weeks for the international community to intervene, which I think is more or less Pakistani defensive doctrine. For them to maintain their own modernization plans, they needed to close this gap in economic performance and in social performance. It simply was not plausible to believe that the Pakistan Army could defend the territory and the national integrity and the national culture of Pakistan in 20 years if the current pattern of separation and economic performance persisted. Neither the Chinese nor the Americans were likely to fund that gap in modernization terms. And so that was, I think, a very powerful argument. Now, there were others. We can achieve our regional goals by political means more effectively than we can by military means. We have failed to achieve a military victory in Kashmir. Let's be honest with ourselves. Perhaps once in a while, some of that honesty surfaced. You never would hear it as an outsider, so it's hard to know whether that level of self-knowledge was widespread. But it was certainly observable that the military campaign had failed and that political negotiations might actually achieve an honorable solution, a solution that would both relieve Pakistan of the burdens of this perpetual conflict, but also uh, allow it to feel morally and politically satisfied that it had achieved a reasonable outcome. Now, the settlement that was being discussed was not complete. Uh, it had started in a kind of zigzagging fashion, as best I can sort it out. The two territorial disputes that were most fully resolved by the end of 2006 were Sur Creek, where the two navies, I think, had carried out a joint survey to map how the map would be drawn, and that deal was essentially done. And then Siachen, the war at the top of the world, where I think quite a lot of agreement had been reached about the final positions that the deployed troops would take. And there was still some work to do about exactly the sequencing, the trust-building modalities by which you would get to the final positions. But that is the sort of thing that seemed achievable. And then Kashmir, where I think it's ambiguous as to how much was agreed and how much was left to be done. But essentially, the vision articulated by Prime Minister Singh in so many forums was the framework. There were sources of ambiguity about what the local body would have authority to do or not do, what its role would be. And there was work to do. And as we've seen in post-Oslo, post-Madrid, Middle East, sometimes that work can prove to be much harder than you think at the outset. But the agreement, which was meant to be announced on a visit that Prime Minister Singh was going to pay to Pakistan early in 2007, was never consummated because right at the moment when Prime Minister Singh's visit was to occur, in fact, at a time when the two back-channel negotiators were on the day that they were in a hotel in Dubai negotiating the final timings of Prime Minister Singh's visit in Islamabad, what he would do at each increment of the visit. So they were down to that level of final agreement. President Musharraf decided to fire the Chief Justice of the Pakistani Supreme Court. And, you know, it really is tragic in some respects, but also literary that in a sort of Elizabethan or Shakespearean sense, the protagonist's flaws undo him just at the moment when he is about to triumph on the field. And here, the flaws, of course, are his extraordinary degree of self-belief and his tin ear for Pakistani politics. You know, the structural problems that he had created around his own presidency were much deeper than the conflict that he engendered with the lawyers' movement and the Chief Justice. He had failed to build a relationship with the Pakistan People's Party that was a natural alliance for him. He had failed to locate allied politicians that were more skillful than the Chowdhuries. He had failed to understand what his problem was, and so he was consumed by it. He had failed to manage the sort of balancing act with the militias, the Kashmiri militias that he continued to hold in reserve, but who increasingly were disenchanted with his rule, and et cetera, et cetera. So think about 2007 and 2008, such a cataclysm from the time of the dispatch of the Chief Justice to the Red Mosque, to the return of Benazir, her assassination, and finally the sort of internal move within the Pakistan military to replace Musharraf. And so we've lost that moment. And it took a couple of years, even for the publics, I think, to understand or to begin to understand what the moment was that was missed. And I want to finish by talking a little bit about what we do now that that moment is lost. How do we think about the choices going forward? Obviously, the framework, the engineering blueprint that could start to construct a practical version of Prime Minister Singh's vision of a region where borders don't matter, but where nation states preserve their integrity, is now sketched. It's sketched. We can talk about how firm the pencil drawing is, but it's there and outlined. It's been tested by time and by leaderships on both sides of the border. But how now to bring it into being? Obviously, on the Pakistan side, the equation has changed dramatically. And for better and for worse, the unity of Musharraf's rule has been replaced by that familiar episode, that period in Pakistani history when weak civilian parties share power with an ambivalent army, uncertain about its satisfaction with its retreat from national politics, continuously pinching the space in which civilian politicians work, constantly defining its prerogatives, concentrating on its corporate interests, not yielding the possibility of a return to power, and so on. A familiar period in Pakistani politics. And the partners of that army on the outside continue to enable all of its pathologies through the short-term imperative of a security crisis. That is a real security crisis. It's a security crisis for the United States. It's a security crisis for Pakistan. It's a security crisis for India. We're not inventing it, but it is an enabling crisis for this debilitating pattern of the Pakistani army's role in national life. So I want to offer, as I finish, a couple of hypotheses about how to engineer the blueprint that responds to Prime Minister Singh's vision. And before I get to my specific hypotheses, I want to recognize that these choices are extremely perilous and complicated. What would happen if, for example, the two governments announced a bold peace? What could you reasonably forecast would be the reaction inside Pakistan? This is a country that is already facing an internal insurgency motivated by the argument that the Pakistani government has betrayed the principles of Islam and the founding principles of the country, and is illegitimately in thrall to choose your conspirators, India, United States, Israel. If that government were to identify itself with a settlement with India, it would invite even more recruiting, even more intensified engagement with that narrative. Now, if the government were unified in opposition to that narrative, if it were committed fully to the proposition that these groups are themselves illegitimate and must be eradicated with every ounce of strength that the admittedly weak Pakistani state can bring to bear, that would be one thing. But that is not the case in modern Pakistan. We have a divided state. We have a divided security establishment. We have people divided within themselves. We have people who who compartmentalize their thinking and their activity from hour to hour in some cases. And in such a divided polity, if you bring this kind of pressure to bear on it, you're taking a considerable risk. Now, failing to act, persisting in this pattern, this debilitating pattern of security over economic integration, of the crisis over the long run, is also, I think, an enormous risk, presents an enormous risk. So that doesn't let us off the hook. Now, one question that has to be resolved is, what is the best way to think about the role of the Pakistani army in this equation? I think if I were the Indian government, I would be tempted to wish for its return, only for the reason that it provides coherence. There is a kind of Nixon to China argument about the elusive prospect of peacemaking across the border, that only the BJP and the army ultimately could defend this kind of risk-taking settlement against their domestic constituencies. I think that there are people who believe that, But my own hypothesis is the opposite. I think in the long run, only the civilian parties in Pakistan can deliver the kind of sustainable peace that is required. I think that increasingly they are committed to it. I think the declaratory positions of all four parties, major parties now, the PPP, the PMLN, the MQM, and the ANP, essentially endorse this vision. It is in their interest to pursue it, more importantly. And their constituents want it as much as the comparable community on the Indian side does. How to strengthen them is, I think, more the challenge. And ultimately, the only way to do that is to create economic growth, in my estimation. When I think about the model to engineer this blueprint into being, I think about other countries with troubled civil-military relations, internal violence, and a seeming narrative of dead-end repetition of military intervention against nascent democratic politics. Indonesia, the Philippines, Colombia, and Turkey in another era. Now, how was it that the militaries in those four countries were eventually removed from as an obstacle to regional economic integration and political settlements? Obviously, all analogies are flawed, but I think I'm going to extend my engagement with these four. How was it that that pattern of civil-military coup-making, intervention, and this narrative of threat as an obstacle to economic and political integration was resolved? It was actually not, in any of those cases, by the wand-waving act of a bold peace pronouncement. It was by the gradual development of alternative incentives inside the political economy as a result of trade and economic integration. Once the economies began to grow at a certain rate, once borders were opened, the borders of political space began to shift internally to the point where, without ever declaring the day, there came a day when the Indonesian military and the Turkish military and the Philippine military woke up in a position to which they were unaccustomed, one in which they were no longer the predominant institution in their polity. The only way that such an outcome can be constructed in Pakistan is to engineer the kind of economic openness and trade agreements bit by bit. It has to be, I believe, increasingly an undeclared peace rather than a declared one. It has to be engineered through economic agreements that take the $18 billion in undocumented trade between the two countries and find quiet ways to continue to build on that. I think the time horizon is probably more like 5 to 10 years than 5 to 10 months. And I think that the mechanism has to be the recovery of the Pakistani economy after the floods and the emergence of economic integration and prosperity in Pakistan that the military enjoys sufficiently, as it did in Indonesia and the Philippines and Colombia and Turkey, so that the goalposts shift without anyone watching. It's a story of tides rather than of instant transformations, I think. But I offer that to you as a hypothesis and not a declaration, and welcome your thinking and your questions. Thank you for your patience and paying attention. I appreciate it.
And there's a mic moving around, so please, once he's recognized you, would you please wait until the mic comes to you and then pose your comment or your question, preferably the latter, and preferably very briefly so we can get as many in as possible.
There's someone in the back, and then we'll come forward.
If I could pose you a question. assume that the two narratives you talked about are not even valid, and there's a third narrative that is going on today. And that narrative neither concerns Islamabad nor it concerns Delhi, and it truly concerns Peshawar. And that is,
I'm sorry, truly concerned.
that concerns Peshawar, the capital of
I know where it is.
Pakhtunistan or
Yeah.
Khyber Pakhtunkhwa. What if, and this is something we hear from people all around Pakistan, what if what we are seeing here is a struggle for reunification of the Pakhtuns away from the Punjabi-dominated Pakistan, essentially territory north of Attock, to go back to the pre-Durand Treaty of 1893 and unite with Afghanistan?
Well, I don't think that's what's going on in the west of Pakistan. I think Pashtun nationalism is a factor in the resurgence of the Taliban. But the potency of that revival on both sides of the border is not primarily a function of unifying Pashtun nationalism. That land has been so fractured by violence and change over the last 30 or 40 years. I think only ideological narratives can unify even small groups of people at this stage. The economic incentives, the role of remitted money, the role of diasporas, the number of Pashtuns living outside traditional Pashtun territory, whether they're in the Gulf or elsewhere, the role of the international community in pouring money and programs and political competition into the region. I mean, those are the factors that shape violence there. And the ideology of revolt within Pakistan, its danger to the Pakistani state is not that it will pull Pashtuns together in violent revolution at this stage. It's that it will spill out of Pashto-speaking areas and become a southern Punjabi revolt as well, as it is in part. And it's true that a prophecy of Pashtun nationalism and radicalism could come into being. That would, in my judgment, most likely follow a civil conflict, a renewed civil conflict in Afghanistan. If there were, post-NATO, a repeat of the formations of the 90s, with the northern groups having even more strategic depth than they did, and the number of and potency of weapon systems around, and the proclivity of outside powers to get involved being much greater, well, then you could have a kind of conflict of existential threat as Pashtun-speaking people saw it, and that could blow back into Pakistan for sure. But I don't think it's fundamentally about ethnic or language group identity. Yes, woman there, I'll just come forward and then I'll circle around as the microphone goes.
Thank you. This is just a follow-up to your comments there. What do you think is the reason behind the violence, as you said, in NWFP amongst the Pashtuns? Can you take us back historically to help us understand a little better?
Well, yes, I mean, Ghost Wars is a good book to read. But essentially you have, after the Soviet invasion, Peshawar and the federally administered tribal areas were the staging ground for a political military campaign run by the Pakistani security services with aid at times from the United States, Saudi Arabia, China, and others. Then on their own more in the 90s, and then back again with the United States after 9/11. There's essentially a machinery, a political military machinery of war with an ideological overlay that was constructed there by state and non-state actors, and it radicalized the population essentially. And what's remarkable is that it hasn't radicalized a majority of the population. The last free election in NWFP, which it occurred in early 2008 after Benazir's assassination, the MMA government that had been installed, that is the religious parties coalition that had been installed by Musharraf, had to stand on its own, and it was swept away. Because, as ever, ordinary Pakistanis found that the religious parties were just as lousy as professional politicians in office as were the secular parties. And so they have to keep throwing them out every time they have an opportunity. A pattern familiar in many democracies, including this one. Yes? There's a gentleman there in front, and then I'll come up to you, sir, after him. I'll just keep going this way, and we'll go around in a
Quick
circle.
question. Do you think it is in China's interest to have India and Pakistan have close relationships commercially and otherwise? And if not, do you think that there could be a substantial block towards the two countries coming together?
Well, it should be in China's perception that it's in its interest to have prosperity across Asia, including all of the way to Central Asia and into the surplus countries of the Gulf. But I think China's thinking about the nature of the balance between its economic and territorial interests is divided and immature, and that this is a question that is still being resolved within the Chinese decision-making elites. And there's certainly important factions that think of the territory to China's west in a traditional way, as ground on across which to draw resources, as a sort of phalanx. And in that sense, the relationship with Pakistan is of sort of importance. Could they prevent economic integration between India and Pakistan? I don't believe so. I believe that they might, in a tactical sense, collaborate with the army in various ways, as they have done in various ways in the past. But the momentum for economic integration and political settlement, normalization, let's call it, between India and Pakistan, is innate to the history of the region and the peoples, and is too powerful for any outside government, including those of China and the United States, to prevent it if the peoples and governments wish to bring it into being. Yes, this gentleman.
No, I really liked your focus on the Army as the pivot and the engineering solution that you proposed. But then you got to the end, and it seemed as though you were almost assuming the problem away by saying that, look, in time, economic interests will predominate, and it'll be in everybody's interest to have detente, or to understand that that's in everyone's interest. And that kind of just assumes the problem away, and you just reiterated that a minute ago. So could I take you back to the issue of the corporate interests of the Army and ask you a two-part question there? The first one is, how deep is the feeling within the Army itself, not merely at General Musharraf's level or 2 or 3 corps commanders, but how deep is that feeling, that is or was that feeling that there was innate interest looking long term, that there was weakness, that disparity between the two growth rates was really going to cause a strategic problem for the Army itself? How deeply understood is that, perceived is that? That's one part.
Mm-hmm.
And the second part is, again, focusing on the corporate interests of the Army. What is a set of incentives, carrots, and sticks that could be engineered both by India, but also by the US and the international community and Europe, who have a great interest in controlling things in that part of the world? What is a set of these carrots and sticks that could be effectively devised, and that you would recommend?
Yeah, so those are both outstanding questions, and you went like a lawyer right to the weakness in my presentation. You asked a sort of a fact question first, which is, what is the scope of the thinking about this corporate interest within the Army? Um, Let me approach it first by saying that when, if a representative, modernizing, internationally minded Pakistani three-star were in this room and he heard my account of Pakistani Corps Command discourse about the Army's corporate interests, which was inflected with cynicism, really, he would have responded by saying, "You're wrong. The Army wants normalization. The Army recognizes that we are a modern institution in a big, wide world, and we want respect as a modern Army." Now, that might be disingenuous, but I mention it because it would be sincerely felt, and it would be quite emotional. And what it tells you is something important that I think is sometimes underestimated about this Army and probably many armies. There is an enormous degree of professional pride in the Pakistan Army and esprit. This is an organization that sees itself as the finest institution in the country, as the guardian of the country's integrity, as one of the finest militaries on a per capita income basis in the world, as an institution that has fought above its weight. Now, is it self-deluding in some respects? Yes. Is it corrupt in other respects? Of course. But this pride is a very powerful source of esprit. And remember, as recently as 2008, when the Islamists came out of Bunair and started walking toward Islamabad, all of civil society that had been rallying against the government, the lawyers' movement, the political parties, they melted away. They did not have the esprit to stand against the Taliban. It was one thing to throw rocks at the police. It was another thing to be beheaded on video by a bunch of teenagers. Well, the Army stood and fought. They took casualties. They've taken casualties. Those casualties are not a propaganda story. It's a reflection of the pride. And the reason I emphasize this is that I didn't mention this in my litany of reasons why Musharraf brought the Army to the table, but I think it's important. The Pakistan Army would like to be recognized as a globally legitimate institution. That the narrative of legitimacy and illegitimacy is important to its leaders and to its officers. They are people like in modern India who are almost all connected by 1 or 2 degrees of separation to an international family or an international world. They live in the wider world. Their brothers are doctors. Their kids are in university elsewhere. They have traveled. And they recognize that the Turkish army is seen as a legitimate, credible, progressive force in its space, that the Malaysian army is seen in such a way, and they believe they deserve their reputation. And I mention that because that sense that we belong to a wider world and that the world is moving toward economic growth, economic integration, innovation, that technology and education rather than territorial conflict are the story of the 21st century, that narrative is available to the Army. So they understand that. They may not understand the PowerPoint slides that were put up in GHQ about exactly what the consequences for certain weapon systems acquisitions would be if GDP separates and this sort of thing. But the broader narrative that surrounded that India is about to undergo transformational prosperity. It may be a middle-income country in its cities within 10 or 15 years, and we are not. That is very widely distributed in the Army, and that has implications for the corporate health of the Army is also very widely understood. But it's not just a numbers game. It's a narrative of identity and what is our place in the world. And I think that also is one of the answers to your second question. If you ask, and I have tried to think over the years about where American conditionality has successfully coerced the Pakistan security forces' behavior and where it has provoked the opposite of its intent, because that would be one sort of political science exercise that you could run. And I think we need a PhD student to actually do this to have a kind of thorough grid to look at. But in my experience, one area where American conditionality and European conditionality has been successful is where it has challenged the legitimacy of the Army in the world among its peers. So sanctions that involve weapon systems, sanctions that involve material punishments have tended to be provocative. sanctions that affect your legitimacy to travel, to participate in all of the international institutions, to be seen as something other than, I mean, the gap between Pakistan and Sudan in the performance of the military in facilitating cross-border violence. I mean, frankly, objectively, if you came down from Mars, you would say, I'm sorry, why are these people in front of the ICC and these people are a major non-NATO ally? I mean, if you looked at the record of facilitating what would be regarded under international law as illegitimate cross-border violence, there's not a great deal of difference in the record. But one army is legitimate or on the cusp of legitimacy, and the other one is not. And when the United States has threatened that legitimacy in the 90s, I think the Pakistanis have tried to move the needle as aggressively as they can to get out from under the cloud, at least. It's a tactical thing. So I think you have to get to fundamentals. I'm convinced increasingly that you have to tell the truth to the Pakistani people. You have to tell the truth to Pakistani political formations, incrementalism, private negotiations, material threats, the threat of withholding. All of that has been tried. It's failed. The Pakistanis, if you were on their side of the negotiating table, in the context of 2010, why would you regard these threats as credible? I mean, really. What is it that the United States is preparing to do? And I would say that, fundamentally your second question is the most important question for the United States and India as partners, and that there's a lot more advanced and detailed thinking than I'm offering in reply that needs to be done, that it's absolutely critical. It doesn't get enough focus, but it will require courage, because I'm not sure that incrementalism is available over the next 5 or 10 years. And so anyway, I guess this problem is at least now well diagnosed by both the governments of India and the United States. That the question you asked, the second question, what is the right mix of carrots and sticks? How do we muster the most effective international coalition to deliver those messages? That's the conversation that's underway. Perhaps it isn't as intimately collaborative at every instance as it should be. Perhaps it's not on the top of the to-do list as often as it should be, but I think it's underway. And one puzzle for me is, and I'll just end on this, but I've been really thinking about this subject over the last few weeks. The United States has had a lot of unreliable allies in the 20th century. And really, I mean, go back into the Cold War period and into the Second World War. And of course, the United States has learned that in an alliance, in a war, or in a conflict, you and your ally may be fighting the same enemy for entirely different reasons, and that may provide conflicts in the way you conduct the campaign. But I've been trying to think of an instance in American history in the 20th century as a modern power when an ally of the United States, in receipt of billions of dollars of aid, or its equivalent, was actively facilitating the deaths of American soldiers in combat, which, not to put too fine a point on it, would be the finding of any inspector general who looked at the record of the Pakistan Army and security services along the border. Now they're doing many other things too. They're fighting their own war. They're taking casualties. They're cooperating with the United States. But a jury of American civilians, presented with all of the best evidence, would find that the Pakistani security services had facilitated the deaths of Americans in combat while in receipt of billions of dollars in taxpayer aid. Now, I can't think of an analogy where that developed. Maybe there is one and I haven't gotten to it yet. But it leads you to the next question. Why would a weak state believe that it could get away with that? Because the gap between its capacity and American capacity is obviously considerable. So why would such a state believe that it could do that? Not why are they bad people, or because they're pursuing their interests, they're doing what states do. But why would they believe it? And I I think yes, American enabling and bad patterns and bad habits and bad assumptions are a part of the picture. But fundamentally, there is a puzzle there. Why would they believe they could do that? And I think the answer is, to some extent, because they possess nuclear weapons.
Quick follow-on question.
Yes.
What would it take for bring about perception in the U.S. or a decision by the U.S. to display that courage that we just talked about? What would it take for the U.S. then to have a different view, take a different view, a broader view, not merely a narrowly focused view of what's going on in Afghanistan, but a broader view that actually does lead them to a strategic solution?
Well, I think the administration, these subjects are not only here in Kirkland and Ellis. There people are wrestling with these subjects. There's if you've been around government, I've never served in government, but I'm around it enough to see that the momentum of just day-to-day operations is so overwhelming that the space in which people can think seriously and take these kinds of intellectual leaps and risks is very pinched. But the stakes are very high. I mean, the problem with the answer to that question is that the most likely scenario in which the United States would reconsider its policies is one in which something like the planes attack of September 2006 succeeds. Hundreds of Americans, Britons, and other citizens are dead in the Atlantic Ocean or someplace else. The forensic evidence immediately traces back to Pakistan. Turns out that some element of the security services had contact with the forensic trail, and now American politics is a runaway train. And unlike Indian politics after Mumbai, I don't see in the current landscape a winning politics of restraint. So at that stage, you may get an answer to the question, but it will not be a thoughtful one. Yes.
You leave me a bit confused. On one hand, you talk about us giving legitimacy to the Pakistani army, and then on the other hand, you tell me that they're taking money from us and killing our troops. It seems to me there's something inconsistent. I'm also very confused by what role you see for the U.S. government in this, if there's any role at all in terms of bringing about the normalization that you describe. On one hand, it sounds like we do everything wrong, and that may well be. I think we've witnessed quite a bit of that over the last years. Are you saying perhaps we should just sort of adopt a policy of perhaps just getting out of the region?
No, I don't believe that at all. I think the United States has limited leverage, limited influence. I think that the good news is that its influence and leverage is not really required because of the history that I was describing during my talk. The bilateral framework that was set up after Simla has created an adequate forum for this blueprint to be sketched. I have my own views that American silence and complicity in a dysfunctional status quo is not constructive, that I think it's the duty of American leaders to tell the truth and to, not to be gratuitously provocative, but not to be timid about complicated, hard facts. But I'm a journalist. What else would I think? And I think that there's sort of a constructive role for the outsider to kind of throw rocks at the plate glass window. Well, I think it would be to work with India in the way that the previous questioner suggested, to think deeply about how to engineer with international support the kinds of incremental agreements or other agreements that would support the strengthening of civilian parties, economic trade, economic integration, and middle-class formation, economic recovery, and to do that in a way that is politically sustainable. I don't think that will be about making speeches to the General Assembly of the United Nations, but I do think that there is a benefit within Pakistan, and we saw this when the Secretary Clinton visited Pakistan. Very open society. I mean, the media transformation inside Pakistan over the last couple of years is breathtaking. The discourse is a little bit scary because there's a lot of local Glenn Becks and other kinds of, people who are out there just putting it up on the blackboard and talking about it with a great deal of passion. But but when the secretary went in and did this town hall and got just a blast full of hostile questions about American policies, and this is a war on Islam and so forth, and she just sort of said, I kind of have the impression that Osama bin Laden's hiding in your country, and she said things like, people were complaining about the Kerry Lugar bill, and she said, well, you don't have to take the money, and that sort of thing. Actually, Pakistan's an adult society. People understand what you're saying about that sort of thing, and so this kind of pinching your own voice, I don't think is all that constructive. But anyway, as to your confusion, just very briefly, I don't want to overstate my finding about the Pakistan Army, but I was being provocative to make the point that while you could find lots of people in the American government who would agree that the evidence shows that the Pakistan Army is not doing everything that it's able to do. That's the measure by which we ought to hold it accountable. Is it doing all that it reasonably could do to suppress militant militias that are attacking not only American and allied soldiers in Afghanistan, but occasionally coming across the border and killing Indian civilians? And I think the evidence is that no, they're not doing everything that they should reasonably do within the limits of their capacity. And that's because they see their interests otherwise.
Time for one more.
Well, let me take Matthew's question since he came all the way up here.
Matthew Asada. I wanted to ask one question, just as we talk about regional integration and economic trade ties. What may be the lessons of European integration and what happened in Europe post-Coal or post-World War II with even things like the European coal and steel community, the dissolution of barriers, the free movement of trade of goods and services? What might that mean for South Asia? What lessons can we draw from that? And is there a comparable organization maybe for South Asia, like a Energy and Water Collective or something along the same lines that brought about peace and stability in Europe?
Yeah, I mean, I think one answer to the question in a South Asian context, which is part of the reason why you sort of come around to the idea that the engineering work of these agreements is just as hard as the engineering work of the big risk-taking announced peace agreements. Because for every trade regime you construct that is more open and involves more new entrants, you are damaging the place of an incumbent. And the closed border has given rise to extraordinarily well-funded and self-protecting smuggling operations on both sides who, I'm sure you'd be shocked to think might have political influence in their own countries. And, figuring out how to engineer change that they don't blow up is at least as hard as engineering change that Lashkar-e-Taiba doesn't blow up. But it does kind of concentrate the mind to ask, well, is it a priority? If it is, then let's get to work on it. I think it's conceivable. When I was working on this story I did for the New Yorker about the back channel negotiations, and I was traveling in Pakistan and interviewing various participants in that negotiation, I came across a Pakistani whose brother was, he was a businessman and his brother was a two-star, I think. And in the way that these things happen, a typical Pakistani Punjabi family, one brother's in the army and the other's in business. And his brother told him at some point in 2006, this is coming. This agreement's coming. Things are really going to start to spin. And so he went up on the border by Amritsar and he leased all this transit warehouse space. It was sort of like the equivalent of insider trading. So, and then it didn't happen. Musharraf blew up on the launch pad, Red Mosque, and he was saying that when my brother comes home, I just said to him, I'm still paying the lease on this thing. When are you actually going to deliver? But it's as complicated a political economy as you could imagine, and a lot of the rackets now are also offshore and involve Dubai and Singapore and everything else. So it was kind of what I had in mind when I was saying that you have to decide what it is you want to engineer, and maybe some energy ought to be poured into that without the narrative of political provocation, because it's hard. It's really hard, and I don't think that the path from post-war, sort of defeat of Germany to the common market, was smooth. I'm not sure how analogous it was because it was in the context of rebuilding and enormous amounts of aid across borders. So the common market and the construction of political institutions occurred in parallel with the recovery. But the problem of incumbents, was the main narrative in Europe all the way through to the Big Bang. Only 10 years ago, that was an awfully long time coming. So.
Well, I want to thank Steve for helping us to lift our sights and try to have some vision of a different reality in salvation. And it's for someone like myself,